everybody. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Hope you're all doing well on what is, at least in Washington, D.C., a somewhat wet Tuesday afternoon. Thanks for being with us for today's webinar. We're going to be talking about online engagement, how to build a better website with brand strategy. We're going to be joined by our good friend Matt Schwartz of Constructive, who I'm deeply indebted to. He and the team there are actually working on our next issue of Change Agent. That's the network's journal that we produce a couple times a year. This next issue is going to focus on a pretty thorny topic, a little bit sensitive. We're going to be talking about racism and how folks working in comms for good have real power to disrupt racism with our work, shifting narratives, having a better understanding of who we're talking to and where we're going, some of the language we use, all ideas that we're going to explore on that issue, and it's going to be really enhanced by the team at Constructive who worked with us in the past on Change Agent. Always grateful for their deep expertise. And so suffice to say, they know a little bit about online engagement and brand strategy. And so that's today what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about how to integrate your organization's values and mission into its digital strategy in order to create a more mission-driven and engaging website experience. You know how critical that is in a world where people are spending 10 hours and 39 minutes a day consuming ideas and information. Increasingly, that's happening in the digital realm. So over the next hour that we're going to be together, we're going to cover the foundation of an effective brand strategy framework, how social impact brands, that's nonprofits and foundations. I know sometimes we think brand's a dirty word, but we're going to talk about how these brands create and deliver brand value, how design translates brand value into a tangible experience, and how to frame website discussions and decisions within a brand strategy. So before we get to any of that, and I hand the mic to Matt, a couple quick logistical items. If you've been with us before, I sound like I'm repeating myself. We're going to be taking your questions throughout this presentation. You can use the chat box to send in your questions or chat with one another. Please do so. You'll see I tried to prompt a couple of you with some questions earlier. Feel free to jump in there. You can also engage with us on Twitter. Our friend Yabby is downstairs, and she is going to be recording these proceedings under the hashtag ComNetLive. That's ComNetLive on Twitter. And as we always do, this webinar is being recorded. We'll post it up online for free replays. You can get to it through comnetwork.org or just visit our YouTube channel. So with that, thanks for joining us. Matt, why don't you go ahead and please take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sean. Everybody, thank you very mumuch for joining us. I'm really excited to be presenting here on something that I've had a lot of focus on over the years. And I'm just, with no further ado, going to jump right into it. And very quickly, a little background on my firm and myself. So we're a social impact agency that works exclusively with ambitious organizations in the social sector. And we combine a range of different expertise spanning from brand strategy and development and design and digital content, and then also workshops and training and consulting work. We've been doing this now for 23 years. I founded the company 23 years ago. And my background is in brand strategy and design. I started as an interactive designer actually back in about 1995 and have over the years sort of evolved and grown into integrating ideas of brand strategy into the design process. Real quickly, want to say that if you have questions that don't get answered during the session and you want to follow us on Twitter at @HeyConstructive on Twitter, you can absolutely send questions and we would be happy to get back to you, so please do. And here's a quick overview of how we'll be spending our time. I like to break up my sessions into a discussion of principles and then practical exercises and ways you can put them into work. My thinking and feeling about webinars is that it's important that people understand the underlying principles and ideas that are fueling some of the things that are recommendations that I might make or best practices that we have, et cetera. But I know folks also want practical tips and things they can take away to apply to their own work. So we've got a nice, healthy amount of time dedicated to that. In between, we'll have a brief Q&A between part one and part two. And then we'll have questions at the end. And if we're going along, just everyone should know I'm happy to stay on and answer questions as long as it's reasonable. So let's jump on in. But before we get to part one, I want to conduct a little experiment quickly. And we're going to have a quick poll against for people to respond to. And I'm going to show you a website. We've got a simple question. How effective do people feel that this organization is? Let me give 2 seconds to take a look. How effective is that organization? And let's get some answers to this poll and see what people's impressions were. All right, we've got somewhat effective pulling in at 70% or so. Not effective at about 0.25%. Highly effective, pretty low. All right, I'm going to move on real quickly then. How effective is this organization? A couple seconds to look. All right, let's answer the same question. All right, well, we obviously have much better in the effective and highly effective range. 2% of you feel it's not effective. That can happen. All right, so this organization and this organization. Which organization are you more likely to support? The one on the left or the one on the right? All right, and at 100%. How about here? This organization or this organization? Whose research is going to be more influential? Let's look again, left or the right? All right, we've got it almost a unanimous in favor of the right. And so the thing here, of course, is that in every single one of these examples, this was the same exact organization just after a strategic website redesign. And I think what we can see here is that just taking a look at a quick glance gives you a very different impression of the very same organization. And with that, we're going to jump into part one of the principles. So what can you expect? What are we going to cover here? We're going to go over how important design is to an organization's website and specifically why. What are the keys to an effective design process? How does brand strategy improve the design process? What does brand value mean for the social sector? And how do people experience brand value? And we'll kick this off by saying, what are the top five considerations that influence website credibility? There was a study done by Stanford's Credibility Project for their Persuasive Technology Lab a ways back that I've always found very interesting. And they asked every person what factors led them to believe that a website, and therefore the organization, was more credible. And out of all respondents, 46% of the time, people said design aesthetic was the highest. Overall design of information was almost at 29%. You had design focus at just over 25%. And then at the end, the last two, the organization's motive, its mission, let's say, was a company. They were looking at the motive of the company. And then the usefulness of the information. And so what I think is really important here to say is that the three most influential factors that determine a website's credibility and therefore the credibility of the organization that it represents are all design related. So design clearly plays an outsized role in how we perceive the credibility of an organization, how much we believe in it. And this is not only important, also research indicates that people form an opinion about a website in about as quickly as 50 milliseconds and often leave a website page after 10 to 20 seconds. So design is overwhelmingly leading or helping them form an opinion, and that opinion is being formed incredibly quickly. So why is design so important then? Well, there are a lot of reasons we could go into it, but there are a couple that I think are probably worth noting. And the first is that biologically we're a highly visual species, right? So we're hardwired to identify safety, threats, things that we think are useful, make life or death assessments based on how things look very quickly. It's just how human beings are wired. Design is also very indicative, right? It communicates a sense of status. It indicates what people should expect from someone or something. It's kind of a pickup on that idea of being a highly visual species. And for humans, it makes ideas tangible, right? The idea that humans design anything is quite an incredible thing, right? And why do we do this? Well, it's how we translate these ideas and aspirations that we have into something that's tangible that we can interact with. You go as far back as the idea of writing, right? Well, we did that for a reason, and that's so that we could translate our ideas into something that we could interact with and share. And it is literally all around us, right? If you think about it, design is how we navigate, understand, and experience everything in the world, from how to cross the street to content that we read to navigating websites. Everything that we do in the built world, in the human-built world, is really design. So that's how we relate to and understand a whole lot of stuff. And going back to our website credibility and understanding design's role or influence in it, your website ultimately is one of your most important assets. And why is that, right? First is it represents the entirety of your organization and its work. It's also available to almost anyone, anytime, anywhere around the world. It's got to meet the needs of different audiences with different goals and priorities. And it plays a vital role in supporting your people, your staff. And there are a whole host of really important things about a website. And the first is, right, for many people, this is the primary means through which they understand or interact with your organization. And actually, design is the primary means through which people experience your organization. So the design of your website is the thing that's connecting people to your organization. And the website is the totality of your entire organizational strategy. If you have an operating model, right, your theory of change. Your website is something that tries to translate all of those ideas, everything about your organization, and support it and try to share it with other people. So your ideas, your values, your mission, your programs, you may have products, the underlying operations, your overall mission, right? And your website can actually affect a lot of people's jobs within your organization, the workflows behind it, maybe you publish a lot. It might be connected to all sorts of systems on the back end, grants management databases, publishing systems, email, marketing, all kinds of things, right? So your website is trying to be a representation of your entire organization for everybody. And you don't interact with any of these people directly when they come to your website, right? The website has to try to anticipate it. It has to understand what people's needs might be. What are they interested in about you? Why do they value coming to visit you? So the website's got a lot to do, right? It's incredibly important. But there's actually one thing, and that is that people aren't interested in your website at all. What they're actually interested in are the opportunities that it provides them to accomplish their goals and to engage with your organization, right? The website is just a proxy. It's not really that people don't care, but unless you're a designer strategist or maybe, you're researching other organizations' websites in your sector, people aren't evaluating how good your website is. They're evaluating how good your organization is, right? Right back to that idea of your organization's credibility and the experience that your website is delivering to help them understand your organization and help them accomplish their goals is what they're interested in, not the visual design of your website. That's just a means to an end. And actually, since you often hear a lot, people talk about the idea of user experience, right? I mean, user experience design is obviously a huge part of designing for digital, but people don't have user experiences at your website. Does anyone show up and say, oh, I'm having a user experience? No. They have brand experiences with your organization that your website is making possible. So again, the website is a proxy for interacting with the totality of your organization. Everything that it thinks and does, its values, all the stuff that drives you, that's a lot, right? And it's what people are trying to connect with when they interact at your website. And that's where brand strategy comes in, right? How does brand strategy ultimately improve the design process? Because we're trying ultimately to create a website that is a good translation or embodiment of your organization's strategy. Well, brand strategy is that thing, right? If you've engaged in the brand strategy process, you understand that brand strategy is something that helps people understand and refine their positioning, how they talk about themselves, how they relate to their different audiences, whole host of things, right? Well, brand strategy is really important to the design process because it provides stakeholders with this context that they need to frame design ideas and decisions so that they're tied to the outcomes that an organization is looking for. I like to say very often that design ultimately is all about context, right? Back to this idea of how design helps us navigate the world, how it indicates things to us. Well, that's all about context. It's about sorting things out for us. You need to understand context to design effectively, otherwise you're just making things for no clear purpose. Well, if you're trying to design something that's an effective website for an organization to represent its strategy, then having a really clear, detailed, and thorough brand strategy is a great way to give you the context you need to make good decisions. Now, what is a brand, right? I think we're hopefully past the point where we have to convince nonprofits that they have a brand. You have a brand whether you believe in it, like it, or even pay attention to it or not. But what is a brand? And I think a good way to simplify it is this statement up here, right? A brand ultimately is about an exchange of value between an organization and its audience. And I'm going to explain a little bit of what that means. But I think what's important here is that in my experience over the years, nonprofits in particular don't normally really discuss value, brand value, right? It kind of feels a little businessy. It doesn't exactly, the shoe doesn't fit to some degree, it feels like, right? And that's understandable, but I think it's actually a shame, and I hope to explain why. You know, if you don't look at your organization through the lens of value creation, then you're missing the opportunity to connect people to why you matter. And let's look at it this way. This exchange of value ultimately is you've got organizational needs on one side, right? You have goals, you have things you're trying to accomplish, you're advancing a mission, you're trying to be a purpose-led, purpose-driven organization, and you're trying to connect with audiences, and those audiences have needs as well, right? And in between, the overlap of those two needs is voila, right? That's where brand value is. When the organization's needs and goals that you exist for overlap with the areas where audiences have needs and goals, you've got something really valuable and important. And so back to this brand strategy idea, the process is about using research, analysis, ideation to articulate the different ways that social sector organizations deliver and receive value. So when we talk about value, I want to give a quick top-line sense of what is brand value. What are there? There are three different kinds that are really widely accepted in the theory of brand strategy, of brand value, and I think it's really important that people understand them. And some of you may have heard them, right? Tangible value is the first one. It's the easiest one. It can be quantified, right? Tangible value would be, 5,000 songs in your pocket, right? The iPod. That was a very quantifiable, tangible value. So the features, the functionality, when you look at impact measurements, for example, for an organization, those measurements are fairly tangible. You can actually see outcomes. So that's the first line or level, if you will, of the value that an organization can offer. The second is intangible value, and that's a bit harder to demonstrate, and it's best described by qualities, right? It's a bit about a person's emotional or psychological needs. It's the way something makes you feel. And the way you feel about something, feeling good about it or bad, etc., is really tied to your emotions, psychological things, what you're interested in, right? And when organizations offer, and values are a great example of this, which I'll get into, that stuff's a little bit harder to quantify, right? It's not tangible by its very name. It is the opposite of something tangible. It's kind of a concept. And then further out on the spectrum is this idea of aspirational value, which is really another version of intangible value. And it's concerned a bit more with ideas of status or identity, how we like to see ourselves or how we would like other people to see us. So if we associate with a mission, for example, we do that because it's important to us to be the type of person, right, who supports an organization that's working on things that we feel are important. That's an aspiration. And there are lots and lots of examples of that. And the thing with the different types of value is that on one side, it's objective and controlled by the brand because you can determine what the features are. And on the other side, it's subjective. It's controlled by the audience, right? I can't quite control someone's aspirations, what they think about, or even how they feel about something. I can try to sort of link up with that and create designed experiences that sort of hopefully work, and that's why you do research and such, but ultimately they are controlled by the audience. And these two are the most important in a way, right? Because social impact brands are heavily defined by intangible and aspirational value. And these kinds of things, as I mentioned, are described through subjective qualities, they're controlled by the audience, and even the most concrete qualitative impact statistics, when we think about that, and I said that they're tangible, right? Well, yes, they can be quantified, but for a lot of people, those are still intangible because I can't directly experience the impact that is happening in a faraway place or things that are not part of my daily life. I can hopefully believe that they are happening and they can be communicated to me, but it's still something that's not tangible. So the challenge for social change organizations is closing this gap between audiences and their feelings of why an organization matters, why it has value again, and ultimately even its impact. And brand strategy is all about identifying and sort of understanding that. And I think what's really important to know that we talk about values. One of values and mission are probably the two most important things when you talk about defining what drives a social impact organization. So as an incredibly important driver of an organization, well, the thing is that they're also one of the most intangible and subjective aspects of an organization. They're the most difficult to communicate. You can say them, but what does gratitude or generosity look like? What does it sound like? If you're interacting with it on a website, what does that mean, right? But the website is trying to connect people to your values and to your mission. So it's really important, actually. And so to summarize this idea of brand, just to put a capstone on the idea of how important having a clearly defined brand is, right? I think Christopher Stone said it very well. He used to be the president of Open Society Foundations. And I think this statement here, what's really important is that it talks about brand as an idea that is a strategic asset, not for communication, though clearly it's important to that, but something that can help engineer collaborations and partnerships. It's a way to define an organization. So when we take a look at developing brand strategy, right, this is where we get into doing brand strategy. And this is how you uncover and distill all this complexity. And you work on things like developing brand assessments. And you work on articulating those assessments and all that research into a clear brand strategy that does things like articulating a word perfect mission and vision and brand community and characteristics. And you might even try to make them a bit more accessible and create a handbook that can be shared with staff so they don't have to read words and loads of strategic documents. But ultimately, you do all this work and you still do end up with an awful lot of words, right? It's still a lot of ideas that you are trying to articulate so that you can express your organization's values, that you can speak to your mission, that you can talk about what makes you different or qualified and what your theory of change might be, what your relationship to your audience is, all of those things, right? So ultimately, you have a lot of words. So the next thing is you've got to translate it into design. And this is where design as the fundamental discipline, tying back to this idea of why is it so important to website credibility, organizational credibility, and this idea of experiences, right? You need design to create inner experience with an audience. It's, again, what makes these ideas tangible. And social impact organizations define how they advance their missions through things like strategic planning. Brand strategy then, as I just showed, right, translates this operating model into things like positioning and messaging, but they're still just in the realm of ideas. And ultimately, that has to be the overlap of that strategy with design is how you create experiences for people. And that's what experience design is all about. That's what we focus on at Constructive when we think about this intersection of brand strategy and design. So real quickly, this is the last item in section 1, and then we'll get to some questions. I could give an entire session just on this. So pardon me if this is a little heady, but I think it's important and hopefully it'll be clear to people. So social impact experience design, right? What is it ultimately? So it's this idea that if you take a look at values and mission, you've got, well, let's start in the middle, right? You've got the organization's perspective, right? We talked about organizational needs. And you've got the audience's perspective. Well, on the organization side of things, it's how you express yourself, right? That's what communications, what so many of you and we do, that's what communications is all about, expressing things. And on the audience's side, right, it's receiving it, it's engaging with it, and that's what the audience sees. Well, the connective thread between those two sides of the coin of expressing what your organization is all about and engaging people with it, at the very top is your North Star, right? Values and mission. I would say it's strategy as well, your organizational strategy. And the through line down below is that value that you create through the meaningful parts of your mission and how people get value out of it. So this is what experience design is thinking about. And so by focusing on how an organization's mission delivers value to an audience, digital strategy can then extend beyond just user experiences, as I talked about, which isn't what people actually are having, to look more holistically at the deeper nature of an organization's relationship with its audiences. And so as a quick wrap up, before we take our first round of questions, right? Websites are a primary means through which people learn about and engage with social impact organizations. We learned that design is the most influential factor in determining website quality and credibility. Brands are built on this idea of total perception of value exchange between an organization and its audience, that overlap. And lastly, brand strategy and design work together to create these tangible experiences between people and social impact organizations. And with that, we'll take a little 5-minute break here, and happy to take any questions people would like to send through.
All right, let's go to the first one. Christina asks, what does the word or the phrase design focus mean?
What does the, well, that's, I guess you could, in terms of, in the characteristics. It's how they described it as how the eye moves people through their focus of information, right? It's about design accessibility. So not necessarily the aesthetics, which was the first one, but the actual functional aspects of how well a design solution, if you will, focuses the user's attention so that they can see and find what they want. I think usability is a good example of that, actually, and how intuitive things like navigation are, et cetera.
And this is where, just to follow up, this is a place where you would do like an eye scan. You would watch people who are looking at a website and seeing where their eyes go first and second and how they navigate the page. Is that correct?
That's one way. You would test and ask them to here, find this on the site or try to accomplish a task. In the case of this study, I think they mostly asked people questions about those kinds of things and then got those types of answers. But yes, if you were studying it, that's absolutely right, Sean. You can do heat maps, eye tracking tests, and then just do task analysis. We do that a lot during the research phase for usability design, where you have people run through how something works and make sure that you're directing their eye well through what they would like to find.
Gotcha. Okay, Joanna asks, how can we ensure most of our users accomplish their goals when visiting, e.g., both high-level multilateral donors and potential beneficiaries? So we're all talking to multiple audiences all the time. How do we make sure we have more than one goal, that it's easy for people to discriminate and say, that's for me, that's not for me, but to do so quite easily?
Great question. So the first is to say that we'll get into this a little bit in part 2. I won't cover every exercise we do for these types of things. But the first thing is that when you develop brand strategy, if I'm going to tie it back to that, which is where I think a lot of this needs to start, a very thorough definition through research, interviews, et cetera, to understand what's important to each audience. Again, you're trying to identify what do they value from you, what are their priorities as an organization, and how can you help meet them. Well, once you start to define those things and you create really audience archetypes for that you would use, a lot of people might be familiar with them for like strategic messaging that you might do in communications. Well, that's the first phase, and then the second part is creating website personas that focus on actual goals that they would like to accomplish through the website itself. So you want to link the things that your site can help them accomplish with these things that you know are important to them as an audience. And you have to do it audience by audience, and then you do have to make decisions, because everything's about priority, about what gets the most emphasis. And that's all about design hierarchy, back to ideas of design focus. So it's a balancing act of giving clear indications and pathways based on different people's interests. And the best way is through a strong understanding of their relationship to your brand, and then user personas that follow through on those ideas to be focused specifically on how they can use your website.
Okay. Michelle asks, do you have an example of a website that connects brand strategy and design particularly well?
Boy, I always
ComNetwork.org, Michelle. ComNetwork.org is amazing.
You know what I'm going to say on that, just because I'd like to give I mean, it's easy for me to pick one that I think does a really good example from our website, and I could go online and find one, and I guess maybe what I'll do right now is go to and see which one I like the most from our work. But ones that, if you go to Unbound Ed, unbounded.org, that's a good one. And I think the ClimateWorks Foundation, it's a website we did quite a while ago, but climateworks.org I think also does a nice job. So those are two that I can think of that we did anyway.
Okay. Megan asks, what are the most important things or design elements to have on your homepage? And actually that begs the question that I'll just layer on top of that, which is, how important is a homepage these days with so many people coming in through the side door?
Right. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for what elements are there. I think what's important to do is think conceptually about it, and I'll get to that. I do think this side door idea is really important, and that actually speaks to how important it is to have a really thoughtful and thorough site architecture and strategy, so that when people get there through search into the middle of your website, they get a good greeting even then. I think if you look, the majority of folks, the website might be the single greatest inbound page for your website, but it is not the highest numbered one. Now, with regard to what I think is important to do with that area of your site, I think the homepage, it should give a really good overview of the organization. I think RAPOnline, raponline.org, that's another website we did a couple of years ago, does a nice job of, you have to present people with an overview of you've got to get folks' attention with what the idea is about and hit them with your values and your mission in a quick way that is a nice, strong, quick greeting. But you can't be overburden them with too much, because you need to give them an overview of what's within the entire website. When people do go to your homepage, they're very likely to scroll and check out the whole homepage, right? So the more condensed you can make that, think of it almost like an organizational overview in and of itself, that should provide people with those different pathways. Back to the previous question we got, where some people are going to be interested in programs. Some people are going to be interested in maybe how they can volunteer. Some people are going to be interested in understanding the details of your approach and your theory of change. There are lots of different things that you should give good top-level snippets of, and give a sort of a portent of things to come if they get around.
Okay, and I just want to take us back to this because you pointed to this, but maybe it's worth making explicit, which is as we went through that exercise at the outset where you had us polling and asking which appeals to you, right, among these websites, one thing I think we would all probably take away was hero graphics or large images tend to be, with a little bit of text, tend to be much more effective. Is that true or not true as a general rule?
I think that's by and large true. Again, depends on the nature of the website. You could have a website where the goals of it are really, really transactional, and it's very important to actually not have any image, and it's more of a resource. Some government websites could be like that, and some organizations can serve an almost quasi-governmental function. So in those instances, you might say, look, we know that stuff's important, but we got to make sure we're providing really clear, easy to read, not distracted by other visuals, in points to these things we know people want to get right away. So you still might use that, but you might dial it back as a result.
Okay. Let's move on to one more question maybe, and then we can dive back into this. Miriam asks, how often should a nonprofit or foundation reassess its website and homepage performance? So in other words, how often are you digging in and looking at the analytics and trying to figure out if it's working or not?
Well, I think that, an ongoing assessment and a process by which you do that throughout the year, I think should be what every organization does. Your website is a living thing. I think there is a tendency to sort of, wait a long time, maybe store up some budget, do a big design project, put up a new site, be very happy with it, and then just sort of let it be there. And it's definitely better, but how much better and how well is it serving you is not as clear perhaps. And you can't do that without a combination of things from analytics assessments to even eventually doing some small testing and things to find out from people how good were the assumptions that we made. Even with a lot of research and user testing, you still have to make assumptions once you put something out for a website that's going to be visited by thousands of people. So we tend to do quarterly analytics assessments for sure with our clients. We think that's good, and we think setting aside some budget annually to make ongoing improvements is wise. So I think you should look at it as an ongoing thing. The website is a living thing in a way. You're constantly publishing to it and adding things that change the site from what it was when you launched it. So it's wise to keep your finger on the pulse.
Gotcha. With that, we have some other questions. We will get to them a little bit later. I know some of these things I think are things we're about to touch on. So why don't we go ahead and move ahead?
Excellent. Okay. So, the important thing to think about, these are some practices, right? And here are 5 different practices I'm going to walk through with you. And these are practices that if you go through the slides, you'll be able to get a feel for how they work. The first is to say that the idea of, having a good design process. You need to, the big issue that we find with clients is that you've got to create alignment and a shared vision for the kinds of experiences you want people to have, right? But lots of people have different priorities, and different people have different levels of fluency or facility with the idea of talking about design decisions, content decisions, technology decisions, all these things that have to go into building a website in order for it to represent your organization and allow people to engage with it. And not being experienced with the design process or comfortable speaking to it can't be a barrier to participation, and it can be for some folks, right? If it's a barrier for participation for folks who maybe are in charge of programs or one individual program, and they're just not necessarily somebody who comes to that kind of approach naturally, well, their interests may not be met as well, right? So I'm going to walk through here some hands-on training. These are normally parts of much longer client workshops, so it may go a little fast. But I wanted to give all the steps so that if people ultimately wanted to revisit this, and I know the webinar will be posted online, you could look at these steps and follow them yourself. But back to this idea quickly before I go into them of an effective design process, there are 4 main characteristics from my perspective, and this is what I wanted to make clear we are after collectively as a group, as a design agency, and as people who work within social impact organizations that we work with. the first thing is it needs to be accessible, right? This idea that I was just talking about, built on a common language that facilitates dialogue to help bridge knowledge gaps in organizational silos. And it has to be collaborative. It has to be structured to help stakeholders with these different goals and priorities, right? You have to work together. You have to co-create. Design is all about working together in collaboration to create a solution. It's about multiple different inputs, context, et cetera. It has to be holistic, right? It has to be integrated in a way that helps teams consider and balance a lot of factors that influence a lot of choices you're going to have to make. And what's important to say there, I think, is I'd like to use a definition of design that I always say, and that is that, design, I got this from, there's a guy named Herbert Simon, who is a Nobel laureate social scientist, one of the founders of artificial intelligence. And he essentially said that anybody who takes existing situations and turns them into preferred ones designs. And that's important because design isn't just visual, right? We think of it that way, but if anyone's been involved in organizational design, you know that's a design discipline, right? So this idea of being holistic and designing with content, designing with technology, designing with visual elements, that's all part of it. And lastly, a design process has to be strategic, right? It has to be driven by these clear goals that help teams navigate what are going to inherently be subjective choices so that you can make effective decisions. So accessible, collaborative, holistic, strategic, that's what we're after in these workshop activities that are part of our design process at Constructive when we're working on projects. And so here's a first example. It's called defining your brand values and attributes. And so your organization's values can be described by how they're externally expressed. And so this exercise will help inform the experiences that your website should ideally create for people, first by identifying core values, and then by describing how you would like audiences to perceive you based on those values, kind of the attributes that you would have. And so how does this particular exercise help improve the website design process? First, it helps you lead with core values. You may have these very clearly defined, you may not have, depending on where you are in a brand strategy process or if you've ever done one. But you can create a more purpose-driven website when you lead the process by clearly defining your organization's values. You can then make those values more tangible by creating a list of attributes that describe how they would be experienced. And lastly, you can create aspirational value. You can create a set of attributes that inform and evaluate website decisions that involve content, design, and technology, and you can bring them all together in a way that connects all of this different type of value. And so this is what this exercise looks like. So like with all of these, you're going to start by getting a group of people together. And so the first thing you want to do in this exercise is describe your brand. So you get participants together and you give them sticky notes and have them write down 5 to 7 organizational values on those notes. Everyone should work individually. And you can have, anywhere from 5 people to we've done these with, 10 or 15, 20. And paste all of the words that come to mind when you think of what a core organizational value is and put it on the wall. And you can actually make this process even more inclusive for very large organizations by doing an online survey component that you sort of integrate into it. Once you have all of these brand values on the wall, you're going to reflect on them and review them. And our goal here is going to be to take all of these many different words that people use to describe their values, your organization's values, and have the group or 1 or 2 people from the group lead organizing those values into groups of similar terms. You'll have synonyms, you'll have duplicates. And what's really great about that, first of all, is you're now going to see where people have the greatest amount of overlap on what the important values are to the organization. And you can give participants a few minutes to then mingle, review, digest them. And one thing I want to say here is that even if you have brand values, or some organizations, in my experience, can be hesitant because brand values are so important to get into an activity like this. Well, these don't have to be your stated brand values that you're going to put on your website and clearly declare. They don't have to be exact, But what they do have to do is be a really good reflection of the collective intelligence of what people think the values of the organization are. And that's because what the next step is going to be. And that's to discuss and decide about these values and pay attention to these larger groups and get 5 to 7 of them and make those your core values and put them up on the wall and choose by choosing one word or phrase that represents each of them, right? There will be ultimately a phrase that probably describes each one of these clusters of brand values or themes, and you choose one. And now once you have that, you can lead a discussion, should be led by a facilitator, asking participants to suggest single or two-word attributes that would describe how those values would be perceived or felt or experienced by someone, right? And what you want to do is start writing those values down, those attributes down next to each core value. And you're going to start to you want to get as descriptive of a type of words as you can possibly get. And you start organizing them around each value, and all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of attributes that explain how your different values might tangibly be felt by someone, these kinds of ideas of intangible value or aspirational value. And so, lastly, your goal here, you've defined a list of values, whether you say those are your brand's values or not. And you're also going to have a list of attributes that relate to those. And you can review those brand attributes and then choose the ones that best reflect the kinds of impressions your brand and your website should create for audiences. And the thing that you can do with these now is you weave them into a project brief. You can weave them into website content. They're really important in the project brief because that's the document that your team would use in a website design engagement, everybody who works on it, both client side, agency side, writers, designers, everybody, to understand what kind of attributes, what kind of characteristics do we want this website to embody. And that will be driven by your organization's values. So our second exercise, once you've got sort of a baseline of values, attributes that describe them, this relates to that question that was asked about defining a brand community and defining your audiences. So a brand community is defined by this mutual exchange of value between different audiences. And so this exercise is one that will help you to develop a digital strategy that advance your mission specifically by focusing on delivering value to your audience. And so how is it helpful to the design process? Well, first, it really helps you understand relationships. So through this exercise, you're going to gain deeper insight into the nature of the relationships your organization has with its audiences, not in regards to what they want to accomplish on your website, but far more deeply in relationship to the value they get out of your organization and why you matter to them. You're then going to be able to create much better personas, right? You're going to create website-specific personas that are informed by these deeper interests and motivations of your audience. And then lastly, you're going to be able to deliver value to these audiences a lot more effectively because you're going to create a framework that focuses your website on delivering the kinds of experiences that people want with your organization. And again, as our previous, we had a question about, different folks will have different priorities and experiences that are after. Through this, you'll be able to create a set for every audience member based on things that are important to their relationship with your brand, a strategic overview. And so this is what this exercise looks like. So first you want to list your audiences. So on a whiteboard or an easel pad, you list all of your organization's audiences, and you want to have room for each one underneath for 2 columns. And on one side you have why do they value us, and on the other side it's why do we value them. You can also say what value do we deliver to them, what value do they deliver to us. And that's that sort of healthy dynamic of a relationship of what we call the gives and the gets. Everyone gives something of value and everyone gets something of value in return. Well, we want to define that for each audience. Now, you want to start brainstorming value propositions. So you want a facilitator to lead a discussion exploring how your organization provides value to each audience and how they provide value to you. And you want to be specific, right? Write down as many types of tangible and intangible value as possible. A great example is, one of our clients said that the people that they serve, the communities they serve, give them a reason for being, right? I mean, it doesn't get much more fulfilling than acknowledging that the people you serve give you a reason for being as an organization and as individuals. And that can be really powerful when you're thinking about that relationship. Now you want to create groups of value, right? So now you've got lots of different lists of all kinds of things that you support, give people that are valuable, and they give you in return in your relationship. So look for relationships and similarities, and you want to start to group them into themes, right? So one of them might be knowledge sharing, could be a theme. We publish resources. We provide access to data. Another might be advocating, right? We write policy papers, and we go out and create campaigns, et cetera. There are a lot of activities that go into that. And the good thing about this is that can also help define the key roles that your organization plays in supporting your community. So we're advocates, we're knowledge sharers or thought leaders, et cetera. Now, once you've done that, you want to start to create an audience archetype. I mentioned these earlier. Rather than a user persona, you want to use these value statements to write audience archetypes that articulate the dynamics in the relationship between the brand and your audience. So you might say that, donors, we provide value to donors by giving them a cause that they can believe in and by being a credible organization that delivers results. I'm being very vague. You hopefully want to be more refined. But the idea is talk about the nature of that relationship and write it as a handful of sentences. And that creates kind of an archetype that says when we're thinking about donors, this is what it's like between us and our relationship. And then use that to create website personas. So you can use your archetypes to create these personas. And a persona, for those who don't know, is a hypothetical individual who matches an archetype profile, right? So you might have a donor named Debbie who is 46 years old, et cetera, et cetera. And what you want to do is use your understanding of the nature of what's important to them to create a list of preferences and website-specific goals that are aligned with the value that they're looking to get from you. And so you can see through this how we start at the top by talking about what's valuable in the relationship in both directions, articulating that as an archetype of each of your audience groups, and then turning that into something very website specific. So exercise 3, define a brand voice and tone. For all the folks who are very heavily involved in writing content, this one will probably be helpful, important. Right? Having a consistent brand voice is important. It expresses your values and attributes. Consistency builds trust. It makes your message more memorable. So you can use this exercise to create a language framework that facilitates creating the kinds of content you want that would be aligned with your values and aligned with the attributes that you want to embody. And so how does it help specifically to improve the website design process? The first is what I call find your voice. Helps you develop a voice of the organization that accurately reflects your mission, your values, and these brand attributes that we're talking about. It helps you create consistency. And by that I mean it increases alignment between the way your organization communicates internally amongst itself and talks about all the things that are really important and externally, right? And actually should create an external facing lens for those discussions so you don't get bogged down with jargon and things that can be impenetrable to people. And it also helps you adjust to situations, the idea of tone versus your overall voice, right? You can create a roadmap for modifying your tone of your voice depending on the situation, depending on different channels you're using, et cetera, but staying true to your organization's voice. And this is what the exercise looks like. The first activity is gather examples. So print out 10 to 15 short writing samples related to your mission. They can come from your own or from other sources. They should definitely come from your own, but you can also include external sources and place them on a wall. Oops.
You still with us, Matt?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, yep. Sorry, my headphones decided to go out. I am here. So you'll print 10 to 15 short writing examples, right, and place them on a wall. And once you have those writing samples, put your audience personas, list them if you have them available or identify them, and write those down so that you're clear on who you're talking to. Once you do that, give participants 10 to 15 green and 10 to 15 red dot stickers. And what you're going to do now is with those language examples on the wall, and you want a variety, right? Some will be very detailed. Some might be very top level. You want to ask people to go through and find the samples that they feel are the most and the least like the attributes your brand should embody. And you can do this for each audience if you want, or at least find ones where you know the nature of the discussion is going to be very, very different. So donors or beneficiaries or clients, for example, communities. Once people have placed their votes and put dots on all the different terms, the different language, have a facilitator lead a discussion about people's votes, evaluating language for clarity, for detail, for objectiveness, for emotion, for intent. You want to have a discussion and have people talk about why they voted the way they did so that you understand and it's not so subjective. And what's really important is to make this discussion tie back to what's important to your audience and also thinking about your values and your brand attributes. Try to tie it back to that and how the language, by its clarity, its detail, its level of emotion, et cetera, accomplishes that goal. Next, adjust your tone. So once you've established a clear sense of what language is the appropriate one, identify how your brand voice should be adjusted for different situations or audiences. And what you can do is write down brief descriptions. So for example, an organization might be involved in very heavy policy advocacy work. They might do a lot of research, and it might be really important that their brand voice overall be very objective, very thorough and detailed, be very rational, let's say. But when you're speaking, for example, maybe through social media, you might change that a little and loosen up your tie a bit. But you also, if you're dealing with donors or you're dealing with folks who are on the other end of receiving benefits from the type of work you do, you might speak differently about it because it's a little bit less about the policy and a little bit more about its impact. And then from this, you can now start to create core messages. And this is how you start weaving this into your actual content. So now that you have a sample that identifies the different types of language that seem appropriate, you've written down descriptions for them, you can use this to write top-level brand messaging or use it for website-specific content. And so what you'll see is you have now a guideline of examples that people have looked at, discussed, evaluated of different ways to talk about your mission and your organization. And you're able to discuss which ones feel right based on what you're trying to communicate as an organization. Similarly, the flip side of this is design language, and it's really almost identical. But this is an interesting one because this one allows you to create a design language by discussing design ideas and concepts and even design techniques and things like typefaces through things like brand attributes and values, which seems like a little counterintuitive, but at some point we're visually designing things, right? And we're trying to represent brand ideas and values. Well, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? So, first of all, what's really valuable here, I mentioned a while ago that it's important to be inclusive for people who don't necessarily think like designers or talk about design. So this increases visual literacy based on ideas that have to do with your mission, your values, and your brand attributes. It also focuses your brainstorming, right? You can focus everyone's thinking on how different images and design approaches make brand values and attributes tangible, make them visible. People often say strategy design is strategy made visible. And you can facilitate design concept development. You can create, you'll see, collections of ideas that are based on values and attributes that can be used to inform your design process. And so what does this activity look like? You're going to gather examples again. And here, there's use 30 to 50. But what you want to do is find a collection of, for example, photos that relate to your mission or your audiences, pictures of your community, places that you are engaged in.
Find other brands or iconic things that people definitely identify very clearly with and might have a reaction to. Find design elements from typefaces to color treatments to textures, any host of different types of things. And then look at interfaces, things like navigation, website-specific elements, all kinds of details, and put them all up on the wall. And you're going to give people the same number of dots, and you're going to ask them again to vote. Which one of these different types of images do you think feel the most like what we want to be, which feel the least? And you're going to facilitate another discussion. And by doing this, the thing you want to do, similar to the language part, is pay extra attention when images have both red and green dots, because those are going to be areas where there are differences of opinion or different interpretations. And those are going to spark the best conversations, because when everyone agrees on something, it's kind of a no-brainer. If everyone disagrees, it's a no-brainer. But where there's a sort of a bit more of a split, you're going to want to discuss that, because it helps people navigate talking about why a visual or a design element makes them feel like it's a good fit or a bad fit. Then what you can do is you start assigning keywords. And you can pull these from your attribute keywords that we developed earlier, right? Write them down as people are discussing things. Write them down next to all the images. People are going to say, I think that this image makes me think of this, and et cetera. Important words and phrases are going to come out. When they do, the facilitator should write them all down next to the words, because these build on the language bank that you can use, and it also makes it very clear why images are making people respond the way they are. Then from this, you've got a handful of images that are a collection of styles, from photographs to typography to web elements. And what you do is you start organizing and collecting them, and you can build one concept board, you can build a variety of concept boards, and you should go and look for additional design elements and ideas, a design team should, that feel like and look like those elements. You don't just settle with those, but now you kind of know what you're looking for. And what should happen as a result is everybody within the organization, when you start getting into design, they're going to see things that feel a bit more appropriate and that they understand why choices have been made, and they're going to relate it back to their brand. And this is the last feature, and that is choosing website features is the last one. And so website features, you've got features and functionality. They're often the most important parts of a website. Things like interactive timelines or interactive maps or a grants database, all these kinds of things. And they're usually very complicated to build if there are advanced features. So it's important to get them right. And so this process of designing those features helps you do that. And it does a couple things. First, you can identify key features. So you can explore features, how well they support the drivers of the exchange of value between you and your audience. So you can figure out which features are actually most important to you. You can then create priorities. So you get to accelerate the process of defining the most important features and functionality for your website. So for example, if you're looking at an interactive map, there are a lot of different ways you could do an interactive map. What's the right approach? Well, this process will help you decide that kind of discussion. And ultimately what that really does is it helps you spend your time and your money wisely by focusing on the features that are the best fit for you, but also focusing on the right kinds of functionality. And it uses something called the Moscow method. You might be familiar with it, some of you. It's sort of must have, should have, could have, and won't have. Some folks use would have, we say won't have. And this is what you do. Start with a discussion, get a group together and start with a discussion of what features you think your website should have and create a list of them. Then you research features that match these types, right, and collect links of good examples for each one of them. And 3 is a good number. You can do more, but you want at least 3, a basic one, a medium one, and an advanced one. Then what you do is you create a table for each one. So you write a feature down, and what you want are 4 columns underneath it, like you see in that photo, right? And you're going to have your must-haves, your should-haves, your could-haves, and your won't-have. And you're going to do that for each feature that you think your website should have in it. Then you evaluate as a group the functionality of those examples, right? So you've got your 3 different examples, you explore them, and what you want to do is make note of what details of functionality they have that you like, right? So on an interactive map, it might have a hover state that shows a certain type of information, or you might be able to zoom in on it. A timeline might have certain types of details. So you list the ones that are really important for each. And then what you want to do is create rows underneath each of the 4 columns for each functional detail. So if you're looking at a timeline, it might have 5 different or 7 different features that are functionality that you thought were really interesting. Put them all down and then have everybody discuss as a group and vote whether that little detail of functionality within that feature, let's say your timeline, is a must-have, a should-have, a could-have, or a won't-have. And you want to do that for your feature as a whole, right? Do we definitely need this feature for our website? Yes or no? How important is it? And then how important are each of the types of functionality we could add into them? And then what you get out of this, which is really important, is the ability to scope what that feature would be like and know what pretty much you're getting in for, right? Use the results to create functional requirements that list the functionality that the thing you're going to create is, and then use that to establish a scope and budget. And so you can see by doing this process of just reviewing and breaking down a variety of different examples of a feature that you know you ideally would like to have, you can understand the different ways you might approach it. You can then break down that functional details, and then you can vote on which ones are must-haves all the way down to we definitely don't need those features. And you can use that to create a scope for how much time and money is it going to cost to do this. And with that, I'm happy to stay on. I know we're a couple minutes over, but I'm happy to stay on for questions. And thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you spending this time with me and with us, everyone at ComNet.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have a couple questions in here, and I'm mindful for those of you who maybe need to move on to something else, feel free to email us. Matt's got his contact information up in there, or you can get them on Twitter. I know they live tweeted a lot of the information that we've shared here, so you can find that under the hashtag ComNetLive, and you can ask your questions there. And of course, Matt and the team will be with us at ComNet 18 in San Francisco if you are among the folks who will be with us. But let's go ahead and take a couple questions that we've been waiting on from earlier. Alyssa asks, Matt, if an organization has multiple levels of focus or expertise, how do you communicate that on a homepage without creating clutter and confusion due to the idea of appealing to multiple audiences? So how do you attack an organization that maybe has multiple areas of focus?
I think there are different ways to approach this, right? And I think the first one is, are you taking a what I call organizational roles, right? These things that you do. Are you taking in a role-based focus lens where you present those all equally? Or are you going to take an audience-based lens where you say, if you're this person, go here. If you're this person, go there. And so that's the first set of decisions. You can break down your homepage by saying, for grantees, for, research experts, et cetera. But if you are listing the roles that your organization plays, I think it comes down to listing which ones are the most important ones. You can either treat them all equally and just have that as a list, and just keep it not too cluttered, right? And that's where small bits of functionality, like on Hover, getting more detail, will allow people to quickly scan, see what they're interested in, and hover if they are interested in more. Another way to do it, right, is to just, in a design layout, emphasize one set of roles or organizational activities or programs with greater emphasis, and then have a best of the rest kind of thing. So it comes down to visual prioritization. Ultimately, that's a visual design decision. And you have to do that based on an understanding of which roles that you play are of greatest value to your audiences. And if you decide you really need to segment based on different audiences, well, then you should maybe take an audience-based lens to the way you introduce yourself on your homepage.
Yeah, I would just layer on, and I'm certainly no design expert, but I would layer on that I think all of us should be thinking about our websites as storytelling vehicles. And so almost certainly, while you may have an organization that engages in 5 disparate spaces, presumably your organization has a story that it tells itself and its board and others about why you're doing what you're doing. My guess is that's values-based, but that may end up being the red thread that runs through all of your work, and that may be the story that you want to convey on the homepage and then allow people paths to enter into places of work that are aligned with that story. That might be one way to attack it. One more question, and then we will sign off here. Payal asks, are there different rules for mobile sites?
Well, for folks who are aware of responsive web design, right, and all sites in a way are mobile, unless you're creating a mobile-specific website, in which case, yes, I think people would create. You don't see it very much anymore. Usually it's one size fits all, and you use tricks to serve one website to different devices, but if you really feel it's critical, and there are examples, right? Certain mobile audiences, a website might serve an incredibly important functional role. We're working with one really big, well-known legal services, social justice law organization, and it's really important that they provide access to information really quickly. Now, we're doing it through responsive web design, but there's an example where actually the interaction with the phone is incredibly important. For some organizations, a mobile website is just making sure it's available to people so they can learn about an organization, but not necessarily get access to information in a very serious situation that they need a quick answer to. But when it comes to dealing with mobile, the most important thing is in the mobile design process to condense areas and remove additional unnecessary levels of detail. People just don't read and explore as long on a website. So this is where the editorial strategy and the design hierarchy and sort of prioritization come in really, they're critical. The first is to focus from a prioritization level on the most important things and give emphasis to those elements and stack them properly, because everything on a phone sort of cascades down into a thinner page, right? The second is it's so important to have really good editorial design strategy, and that's where I find sometimes clients will, unfortunately, sometimes due to budget, they'll write their own site content because they're experts, but they may not be experts in writing website content that converts and understanding how to write that. And that's all about using a journalistic model of writing to delivering the most important top-level thing first and then drill down. And if you design that way, your headlines or maybe a small intro paragraph can show up on a page, and the rest could be hidden with a show me more for people who are on the phone, so it's there, but it's not in the way. So it's important to prioritize quick messages, and sometimes having a good editorial design strategy with writing that works with it to provide top-level messages, et cetera. That makes a mobile website where people aren't going to be on it as long more effective than it would be if you just showed everything that's on your regular site and displayed it.
All right, and I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very, very much to Matt and the whole team at Constructive for a really, really thoughtful session. We're looking forward to hosting you out in San Francisco. And to everybody else, we are looking forward to seeing you out at ComNet 18 in San Francisco. If you didn't get a ticket, I'm afraid the event is sold out, but we will be announcing the destination for ComNet 19. You can go ahead and put those dates into your calendar, October 2nd through the 4th in 2019. I can't tell you where we're going yet, but rest assured it's a pretty fun spot. We will be back with another webinar, I think, after the conference concludes. So it's going to be a couple weeks before we see you all again. But thanks very much for being with us. Be well, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.